G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, talking to historian J. Otto Pohl. Otto, I have a thought to get us started with, like a very basic question, like who benefits from this latest conflict with Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians? So it's really hard to find a list of people who benefit, because America is not benefited by this conflict. I think that's pretty clear. Joe Biden, like, flying to Israel in the middle of this conflict just seemed absolutely insane and very much against America's best interests, as America's support for Israel was a significant reason that Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. So the United States does not benefit from this latest flare-up. Now, it's hard to see how Hamas benefits in the long term, because I assume it's going to be pretty much wiped out as a military unit. The Palestinian Authority should seem poised to benefit if it can get its act together. China doesn't really benefit because it's very likely to have to pay, a lot more for oil. But there is one key player who does seem to obviously benefit, and that's Russia and Vladimir Putin. And he seems to be encouraging all sorts of proxy wars, which are distracting the United States. So I assume that Putin benefits from this. You've got, in all likelihood, higher gasoline prices. You've got the United States distracted from arming and supporting Ukraine. World attention is shifted from the Ukraine conflict. Does Putin and Russia benefit from this Hamas versus Israel conflict? Does anyone benefit? Who are the parties that benefit from this? What do you think, Otto?
Well, I think Russia benefits mainly because it brings to the point there's not enough arms or money from the United States or willingness to give that much to both Israel and Ukraine. So it looks like in the conflict between that the Ukrainians are going to lose out. The amount of assistance they're receiving from the U.S. has already been drastically cut. So the Ukrainians will probably have to cut a deal, which they lose territory that they claim. And that, of course, will benefit Russia. And if the Russians are no longer having to fight, if there is a armistice in Ukraine, they obviously benefit that way too. I'm not sure, other than strengthening ties with places like Syria and Iran, how much they directly benefit from the conflict with Hamas. But the ramifications, certainly for Ukraine, definitely help Russia a lot. But I think Hamas thought that they could benefit long term. It can be difficult to see out, but they're making a huge gambit that if they make a huge sacrifice here, that it will turn kind of the pivot the framing of the conflict more in their interest over the next couple of decades. Now, whether that will happen or not, I don't know, but I think they were making a big gamble because nothing else was working as far as them moving towards their goals versus the Israelis.
And, theoretically, Iran benefits. It makes it, everyone's talking about Iran right now. But, I mean, there are a lot of downsides for Iran as well. Do you think Iran is benefiting from this conflict?
They benefit in some ways. I mean, for a long time, despite being Persian and having a large Azeri minority and not being Arab, they've been the only kind of remaining openly anti-Zionist power. Other states like Egypt and Jordan, even Saudi Arabia and the Emirates were moving to establish diplomatic relations and normalize relations with the state of Israel. That's not something that's been on the horizon for the revolutionary government in Iran ever. It's kind of a principle of theirs, despite not being Arab. So it's kind of the leader, I guess, in the militants or rejection. I guess they used to call it the rejectionist, right? The three no's from Sudan. Iran benefits somewhat that way. But again, Hamas has its own agency, so they weren't ordered by Moscow or Tehran to make the attack. They decided that on their own, believing that in the long term they would benefit. But how long they're thinking, I don't know. I'm guessing several decades. So at this point, to try and calculate it was difficult. I mean, if the Israelis succeed in pushing the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, if they can push them into Egypt or have them resettled elsewhere, obviously that plan by Hamas might not work. But if the outflow of people is not complete, say they lose 30 to 40% of their population, they still might think that they benefit over a course of maybe a half a century. But I mean, it's hard to say because Hamas isn't giving any candid interviews to anybody at this point.
Right, and off the top of my head, it doesn't seem that most critics of Israel are really going to benefit because suddenly Israel's united. Prior to October 7th, like Israelis were at each other's throats. Now suddenly Israel's united. What do you think?
Well, that's true, but that happens with every war. At this one in particular, yes, you're right. That internally there was almost a movement by, I guess, the more left-wing members of Israeli society to try and remove Netanyahu and the Likud leadership over issues of corruption and other things not necessarily related to the relationship with Arabs. And then, of course, now that you've had this attack by Hamas killing, I think, 1,400 civilians. I don't think they have an exact count yet. This, of course, is unified, obviously, the left with Netanyahu. They might not agree on anything else, but they'll agree on crushing Hamas. But I don't think Hamas ever seriously thought that they could overcome those divisions in a conflict. I mean, I'm sure that the smarter Palestinians and Arabs who kind of study the Israelis know about the divisions, but I think they've come to the conclusion that when it comes to, this type of conflict here, they're going to be a Palestine from river to the sea. There aren't going to be very many Israelis siding with the Palestinians. Yuri Davis and Yuri Averny might be the only two.
Who are the most eloquent intellectuals or spokesmen or pundits making the case for the Palestinians?
Oh, well, Said is dead, and but Said was not particularly my favorite. But he did write one kind of basic primer that kind of set out the Palestinian position, the question of Palestine, and it was specifically aimed for Americans that had no background really in the issue. So that's a fairly decent book, but it's very basic as to what the Palestinian grievances are and the kind of history of trying to resolve them. Rashid Khalidi, who took over from Said at Columbia, was formerly University of Chicago, and is, interestingly enough, the supervisor of my supervisor. So kind of my Urgroßvater for the Urgroß Dr. Vater, I guess is the German word. He's written quite a bit, particularly about the difficulties. The Palestinians don't have a great hand to begin with in 48, and even before then when they were dealing with the British and the mandate as far as having any powerful leverage. But there's also the problem, as I said, their own leadership has created a number of obstacles for them as well. If they had had better leadership in an organization, they might have been in a much better position. I'm not going to say that all the agreements offered were that great, but there were a couple of them were certainly better than being bombed into rubble currently.
Yeah. Now, how about the Palestinian Authority? Does it benefit?
I don't know how it can. The Palestinian Authority is in a bad position for two reasons. One, it doesn't have a lot of power. It's a lot, much less autonomous in the West Bank because of the geography and the settlers than Hamas is in Gaza. But also, it's had very corrupt leadership. So the question is, I mean, and this is why Hamas won the election, that the one election that they did have in Gaza, is that a lot of the Palestinians view the Palestinian Authority as corrupt and only for its own benefit, rather than to press any type of fight against the Israelis or try and build or benefit anything for ordinary Palestinians on any type of scale. So this kind of just proves the Palestinian Authority even more impotent, right? Because it's not them that's doing any action. Whatever you may say about Hamas, they have certainly taken action. Whether this action will benefit them as an organization in the future, I don't know. Does it benefit the Palestinians? Probably not, given the fatalities they've already taken. It seems to have been a rather bad gamble if you're looking at it from humanitarian point of view for the Palestinians. But again, I can't get into the heads of any of these people, and it's not like they were ever really open and honest about their plans. Basically, a lot of conspiracy and clandestine type of thinking among the Palestinian militants, particularly those in the occupied territories, as well as places like Lebanon.
Are there any good historians on this conflict who you'd recommend to, at least approach some level of disinterestedness?
There are a number. I saw you had the interview with Matthew. He recommended Benny Morris, whose work still holds up. Benny Morris is interesting as he is ideologically very much on the right side of Israeli politics, almost on the Likud side, I would say. But he is a pretty honest historian, and so his work, I think, holds up pretty well as far as an honest narrative. And I would also agree with what little I saw with Matthew that, the Plan Dalit was not so much a plan by the top, but as giving license to the military on the ground to do it, which is one of the reasons why the ethnic cleansing in 1948 was not complete. There were military commanders who used their authority, particularly in Nazareth, not to push out the Arabs across the border into Transjordan or Syria or Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, Gaza just looks really weird when you look at it on a map, and so apparently Gaza is the result of Egyptian tanks pushing north towards Tel Aviv in the 1948 conflict, and where they were stopped. Essentially, can you? I mean, it's such a weird looking location.
Yeah, well, but it was part of the territory that was supposed to be when they had the partition, which never got off because the Arabs rejected it in part. I mean, that's part of the reason, but that the Arabs didn't want to give up any of the territory. It was to be given to an Arab state, so it was a larger territory than that. And then part of it was taken by the Egyptians in 48 when they invaded. And then it was never annexed to Egypt. It was under Egyptian military administration, but Nasser and Sadat never made it part of the Arab Republic of Egypt.
And I mean, some commentators say that Egypt hates Gaza more than Israel does. What's Egypt's relationship like with Gaza? Why doesn't it just, for example, take it over?
I don't think they want the Gazans pushed into Egypt because they have no ability to take care of them. But yeah, none of the Arab states other than Jordan really have been really strong on integrating Palestinians that were displaced in 48 and their descendants. So a lot of Palestinians have become Jordanian citizens, but that's not possible for most of them in places like Lebanon or even Syria. So the Egyptians, of course, when they ruled Gaza, they never made it part of Egypt. And the Palestinians that were there, most of them refugees or displaced persons or expellees from what becomes Israel's area of control in 1949. None of them ever got Egyptian citizenship, or very few.
Why wouldn't Egypt simply be willing to run the place? Like, don't most countries want more power and more space, even if they don't incorporate it into?
I think because it'd be extraordinarily difficult, as they would have to overcome Hamas themselves.
Yeah, so I mean, one incentive that's operating here is that Egypt's leaders don't want to get assassinated like Anwar Sadat. Is that fair to say?
That may be a consideration. Certainly, there's been a long-term conflict between the Islamic and the Egyptian government going all the way back to Nasser in the 1950s and 60s. So that's a possibility because Hamas is part of that Islamist movement in the Arab world. I'm not sure how strong their connections are with groups in Egypt and elsewhere, but certainly they're coming from the same kind of ideological root as being Islamist as well as nationalists. So that is a possibility, but I think it really is Egyptian government likes the status quo over what it views as the possibility of change. In this case, if they had to deal with 2.1 million people in Gaza, it would not be to their benefit, they don't believe.
Who do you think could plausibly run Gaza after Israel's done smashing it?
I don't know. That's an interesting case. I mean, they could do what they did before they kind of just, walled it off and left it to Hamas. But then they've got the problem of trying to keep the control and police themselves, which I don't know if they really want to go back to that. I mean, it's not a huge territory. On the other hand, if they are largely successful in displacing the population outside of the territory, it might not be difficult. So if they move it down, say there's only 200,000 Palestinians left in Gaza, it's possible they could get enough settlers from Israel proper that they could get a Jewish majority there, and it would be much easier to run. But I mean, I haven't seen any plans or any statements by any Israelis what they would do after destroying Hamas. It all seems to be eliminate Hamas as an organization at the end point that they're currently talking about.
So if you had to bet your life, so you're strongly incentivized to try to be as accurate in your prediction as possible. What kind of timeline do you think there is for Israel to maintain its independent existence as a Jewish state in the area?
That's really hard to say because it depends on all types of things. But I think the gambit by Hamas was that it would shorten the timeline, that it would shift international framing, international support, moving negative opinion towards Israel in the U.S. And other places, and that this would, in the long run, be to their advantage. But I mean, this is very difficult to ascertain because You know, there was a point in the 73 war when it looked like the Arabs were winning, and there was a chance that perhaps Israel would use nuclear weapons. Uh, then they managed to reverse that with using only conventional weapons. But it's hard to say which way the momentum will go because things swing back and forth. And for a long time, kind of the consensus was that there wasn't much the Palestinians could do, and they kind of just had to accept the status quo, and that Israel, within its the armistice borders of 49, would continue to do quite well, particularly in terms of economics and demographics.
And what about the Islamic Republic of Iran? What kind of life expectancy do you see for an Islamic Republic of Iran as opposed to some other type of government of Iran?
You know, that's again hard to say. It lasted a lot longer than many people thought. It wasn't overthrown as a result of the devastating war with Iraq, which caused immense damage in terms of loss of human life and infrastructure. So that government is a lot more resilient than it appears. But of course, things are not particularly good in Iran, and they haven't been for quite a while. When I lived in Iraq, you could look at the exchange rate for the Iranian currency and see that the standard of living was decreasing on a daily basis.
Yeah. How does it stay in power? Do you think it enjoys general support of the Iranian people?
Again, hard to know. Iran is even more difficult to kind of get a hold on than the Palestinian militants. So I think that there is some popular support. But I think a lot of it is like every other authoritarian regime. It's mostly people are just not politically active. They're not. They're rather apathetic as far as their actions towards government, and so this is plays into the advantage of any existing government that lots of people aren't going to oppose it, even if they don't love it. And I think the opposition to Iran is very much split among different ideologies. I mean, in some cases, you have, you know, remnants of the old communist Tudeh represented in organizations like the Mujahideen at Iqaq, and you have some people that would like to have a more democratic, open system. You know, people want to restore the monarchy of the Shah, although I'm not sure how many of those people actually live in Iran as opposed to places like Los Angeles. But yeah, I don't think the opposition, in so much as it even exists in any type of organized fashion, is unified amongst itself. So that also helps the Iranian government in that they are unified, even if they are a minority.
Now, why is there behind the scenes being so much, for example, intelligence sharing between Saudi Arabia and Israel, who on the face of things have historically been implacable enemies, but now they seem to have, at an elite level behind the scenes, they seem to have quite a cozy relationship?
Well, that's been going on for a while. I mean, that started, I think I was still in Ghana when you started having behind the scenes cooperation between the Saudis and Israelis. I mean, a lot of that was driven by the fact that the Saudis and other Gulf Arabs considered Iran to be a much greater threat than the Israelis. So they thought that moving toward normalization and some cooperation, particularly against Iran, with Israeli intelligence would be to their benefit, because they're the main threat to their power, especially in places like Iraq, but also even Lebanon, Yemen in particular. There was a expansion of Iranian influence at the expense of the Sunni Arabs.
And it's kind of amazing that 99% of Saudis would be strongly opposed to normalization, I would expect, with Israel. And yet it could very well happen because in Saudi Arabia, but also in the United States, like popular opinion really doesn't count for much with regard to foreign policy. America's already decided that it will be willing to risk tens of thousands of American lives to defend Taiwan, without regard for how the American people feel about it. And you could have a nation like Saudi Arabia possibly reaching a normalization of relations with Israel, even if 99% of their citizens are opposed to it. Am I missing something?
No, no. I mean, the monarchy has enough legitimacy that it can, go against the popular will on certain things, and that generally includes foreign policy. So they had almost actually normalized relations as far as establishing open diplomatic ties before Hamas attacked, and then the Saudis called it off. But the United Arab Emirates had already established diplomatic relations and direct flights and other expanded open, because there had been a lot of clandestine stuff, as you mentioned before, going on for years, ties with the Israelis. So, yeah, the Arab street is much more anti-Zionist than the Arab governments. In part, that's because of the geopolitics with Iran being considered a greater problem. But it's also, I think, that the Arab leadership kind of view these things as geopolitical problems, whereas the street, it has more of the old style rejectionist front, what the current government of Iran has, viewing of the issue not as a geopolitical one, but as strictly as a moral one, that this is Arab land in Palestine being occupied by foreigners. And so I don't think the frameworks are the same. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the government can establish diplomatic relations with Israel. In the case of Iran, it's obviously not going to happen because they view these things in very, very different ways.
Now, am I right that foreign policy is largely a game carried out by the elite, not just in Saudi Arabia, but also in the United States, where you could have 70%, 80% of the American population opposed to something, and yet, foreign policy will be carried out against the overwhelming wishes of the American people?
To an extent, but I mean, I'm not sure how long that can go on. I mean, if you get something that goes on for years that is costly, like the Vietnam War, eventually the popular opinion does have a role to play. But I mean, the way the U.S. government has gotten away with it after Vietnam is basically to make the cost to the American people minimal. So there's no conscription, there's no draft, something that would be quite noticeable to the average American.
So all these different Sunni Arab governments increasingly making peace with Israel, do you think that they're seeing reality and acting in their own best interests, or have they been hoodwinked by fancy Zionist propaganda?
Oh, no, I think, I said, if you go back, you have to the Iran-Iraq War, and then followed by that, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the U.S. First Gulf War. I said Iran becomes a much greater issue for the Sunni Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, than Israel and Palestine. Because the Iranians are right there, and they have been since the first Gulf War, greatly expanding their influence into the Arab states, most notably Iraq. But we could add Yemen, we could add Lebanon, and this, of course, was considered already in I think the early 1990s to be more important strategically, at least, for the Arab Gulf states than the issue of Palestine. The issue of Palestine, as I said, for the Arab world, most of the time it was put in the framework not as Israel is a geopolitical threat to the Arabs, although you could make that argument for places like Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon on the borders, but that this is a moral issue, right? That the cause of the Palestinians is the cause for all the other Arabs, but that doesn't really work long term because Pan-Arabism breaks down along all kinds of divisions and lines, including, well, if we're in a conflict with Iran over Iraq and Yemen, maybe it's better if we have some normalization with the Israelis to help us. I mean, so I think, though, that was also one of the considerations of Hamas is that they wanted to kind of derail this because if all of the Gulf countries, but most notably Saudi Arabia, were to kind of go the way of Jordan and Egypt and formalize a peace and normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, it would basically remove what remains of Arab state support for the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot less support for the Palestinian cause among Sunni Arab elites privately than the words they may give publicly. I mean, privately, they're probably on Israel's side to a large extent when it comes to dealing with Hamas, for example. Is that fair?
I don't know so much that, but yeah, there isn't any love lost between the Palestinians and the leadership of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia. They have in the past supported them, but they said for a long time these governments were looking at Iran rather than Israel as their main opponent in the region. So the war in Yemen is basically a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran through proxies.
Now, why do Saudi Arabia and Iran just hate each other and are obsessed with fighting each other? Is it primarily over different interpretations of who is the true descendant of the prophet? Or...
I think that's part of it as far as the kind of ideological cover, which goes back a bit deeper. Iran is mostly Persian, about half, but a lot of the leadership are Turkic, whereas obviously Saudi Arabia is Arab. But no, I think it has to do with the great expansion of Iranian influence since the end of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, that they have managed to greatly increase their influence on the ground in Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon. So Hezbollah is allied with Iran. The Houthis in Yemen are allied with Iran. There are all kinds of militias, including the Hashd al-Shabi, which was organized by Soleimani in Iraq. So, you know, there's a Shiite crescent today is infinitely larger in the Arab world as far as having Iranian political influence than it was 30 years ago.
And didn't China broker some kind of peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the last 6 months?
I think so. Yes, there is a bit of movement. I mean, and this is again the Saudis' leadership taking a better, more pragmatic approach to geopolitics. Obviously, when you look at just the human resources of Iran compared to Saudi Arabia, the Iranians have the long-term advantage. They also have a more diverse economy, in fact, that they have some industrial capacity, including for armaments manufacturing, whereas Saudi Arabia imports almost everything in exchange for oil. The Saudi leadership would like to not be in conflict with Iran over these regions in Iraq and Yemen and other places. So if they could have a peace with everybody in the region, that would greatly benefit them. If nothing else, they could greatly reduce their expenditures on armaments.
Now, there seems to be an enormous anti-Iran, enormously funded, though not enjoying necessarily widespread popular support. There seems to be a very effective, dominant, like anti-Iran, anti-Russia ideology that seems to dominate our news media, and I assume it reflects much of the foreign policy establishment. Like, what's behind the visceral hatred for Iran by a tiny number of people who then get to have disproportionate influence? Yeah.
Well, I think there's like two things going on. One, there's kind of like the never forgiving for the 79 hostage crisis.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to have been a turning point for a lot of people. The kind of the realization that not everybody overseas loves the United States, and that a number of our policies, in this case, our long-term support for the Shah of Iran, were not popular with some people, not popular with the Iranians under Ayatollah Khomeini, who established the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's one thing going on. This kind of that the Iranians did us a wrong that hasn't been righted yet. The other thing I think going on is that in the region, the only real competitor to the United States, and we ceased to, and they came about as a result of getting rid of our previous police dog in the Persian Gulf, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is Iran. So, I mean, you look at, as I said, the other states, most of the Arab states, Egypt certainly, Saudi Arabia certainly, places like smaller places that are rich like Qatar and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. These are all pretty much in the U.S. camp. Some of they might dissent on some things, but they're more or less supporting the U.S. Kind of the desired New World Order after the Second World War. So this came late for Egypt, not until Sadat, but it was always the case for Saudi Arabia since the 1943 agreement with FDR and the King of Saudi Arabia. This isn't the case with, of course, the Iranian government. The Iranian government broke away from that and is extraordinarily hostile to all of that, including it's been hostile to the U.S. Allies of Saudi Arabia and, of course, Israel. So, in some sense, it's kind of the inversion, right? We had this very pro-American, westernizing, but authoritarian and corrupt regime in Iran under the last Shah, and the Islamic Republic want to do everything opposite of that.
Now, Putin has completely changed his tune with regard to Israel. I assume he's simply acting out his own national best interest because this conflict seems to be very much in his own best interest. So he has an opportunity here to berate the U.S. for failing to secure some kind of deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and by whipping up or supporting or just simply passively benefiting from this Hamas-Israel conflict, it's good for him in all sorts of ways. Any thoughts on what seems to be a dramatic change in Putin's rhetoric towards Israel since the October 7 attack?
Well, I don't know whether there's not much of change. He just wasn't saying so much. I think we start to see less friendliness by the Russian Federation towards Israel in the last few years over events in Syria, because the Russians were very much supportive of the government of Assad. but yeah, now the Russians have backtracked publicly a lot on the more friendly, normalized relations that they established after the end of the Soviet Union, and gone kind of back to the Soviet anti-Israeli, pro-Arab stance that existed from 1950. 54, 55, when the Czechs sell arms to Egypt, all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, but particularly after 1967, with the Six-Day War, the Soviets were very much in the Arab camp as far as who they supported at the UN and with armaments.
Now, just as soon as the October 7 attacks happened, a dominant part of the news media wanted to blame the attacks on Iran. The Wall Street Journal, read where the story had essentially been overseen by Iran. But Hamas is Sunni, Iran is Shia. There is obviously some cooperation and some mutual interest, but Hamas, by no stretch of the imagination, Hamas is no proxy for Iran. Is that fair to say?
It is, but the Iranian government, on the issue of who they support, as far as particularly sub-state actors, the guerrillas and terrorists, is very pragmatic. So when I lived in Iraq, I lived in what was called the Green Zone of the Kurdish region, which is controlled by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. Now, this is supposedly a social democratic organization that had previously been a Marxist-Leninist Maoist organization. And most of the people that are Kurdish are Sunni. But none of this mattered. The Iranians supported the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan going back to the war between Iran and Iraq, because it was to their benefit to have, a powerful Kurdish guerrilla army in the region of Sulaymaniyah that it could cooperate with. So the fact that they were Sunni, the fact that their ideology was completely secular and maybe even anti-religious, did not bother the Islamic Republic of Iran at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And why do you think Hezbollah hasn't gone all out against Israel?
I think because they don't see any advantage of it for Lebanon. I mean, if they were to attack northern Israel, then the Israelis might turn southern Lebanon into a second Gaza as far as airstrikes. And there was a time when southern Lebanon was militarily occupied by the Israelis. It took quite a while for Hezbollah to remove them from southern Lebanon. I don't think that they really want to repeat that. So I think they're being cautious that this is the fight for Palestinians, not for the Lebanese Shiites, because they actually don't want to provoke the Israelis. I mean, at this point, the Israelis aren't going to lose anything as far as public support over humanitarianism if they extend bombing into Lebanon as well as Gaza. So I think we're seeing a lot of prudence and caution by the leadership in Hezbollah that they would like to avoid being in a conflict which would, even if they won, it would be very Pyrrhic victory because they would take a lot of losses.
What's the status of the Kurds? You used to live amongst the Kurds. You taught at university with the Kurds. What's been going on with the Kurds?
The Kurds?
Yeah.
They still are in it. Well, I mean, they're split between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, but Iraq is the only place they have any autonomous governance. But they are still in kind of the same uneasy relationship with Baghdad as to exactly which powers are federal and which powers are to be allocated to the Kurdish regional government. There isn't been a movement in a while to go for formal independence from the Iraqi Kurds. The last one was when they had the referendum when I was there, which led to the loss of Kirkuk to Baghdad from the Peshmerga being defeated Peshmerga being betrayed basically by Bafal Talabani and the Hash al-Shabi taking the city of Kirkuk. But it doesn't seem like they're making any movement of progress. People tend to forget about the Kurds when other things happen in the Middle East. They never had, because Iraq and Syria were major Arab representatives in the non-aligned movement, they never had any type of international support the way the Palestinians do among various third world states.
And what does Turkey get out of the Hamas-Israel conflict? I mean, Turkey's certainly turned up its rhetorical heat against Israel, but what are its vital national security interests, if any, in the Hamas versus Israel conflict?
Well, it takes people's minds away from what the Azerbaijanis, their very close allies, did to Armenia recently in ethnically cleansing 120,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's, in that sense, like Russia, it's like look over here, don't look over here, right? The Turks are able to shield their Azerbaijani allies and very close kin. The languages are almost identical from any scrutiny because everybody's paying attention to what is happening in Gaza. So there's that, which is very similar to how the Russians benefit in Ukraine in some senses.
Now, why is Azerbaijan taking over Nagorno-Karabakh? What are the incentives that are driving them?
This is one of those weird things, but the territory had been settled by Armenians during Tsarist period of time. But there were always kind of transhuman, kind of semi-nomadic Azeris going in and out of it. But as part of the borders created in the Soviet Union after December 1922, and also with negotiations with Turkey and Ataturk, it was decided that Nagorno-Karabakh, even though it was majority Armenian, very much so, would be under the control of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic as an autonomous oblast. And this didn't really matter because everything was under Moscow. But then in the 80s, there was a big push by the Armenians for greater sovereignty that would include putting the Armenians who in Nagorno-Karabakh under the rule of Yerevan in the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. So from 1988, you see this push, and when the Soviet Union falls apart, there's a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the Armenians militarily take Nagorno-Karabakh and the territory between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh as a link it. But because the borders were whatever existed on the Soviet Republic lines, that was what was internationally recognized, Nagorno-Karabakh was recognized still was part of Azerbaijan. So the Azeris kind of had this international right, as far as that exists under international law, to expel the Armenian military from the Nagorno-Karabakh and the territory slightly to the west, joining it to Armenia. And it took them a while. They had to get a lot of support from Turkey. They got support from Israel. They were at odds, obviously, with Russia and Iran, but they were successfully very recently in retaking that territory, which they had lost for quite some time. And to make sure that it didn't happen again, they expelled all of the civilian Armenians who had lived there for 150 years.
Now, it looks like Azerbaijan can just do anything it wants to Armenia militarily. Like, why is Azerbaijan so much more effective than Armenia?
A lot more people. They have a lot of oil, which they can use to fund weapons purchases. They have close relations with the Turkish Republic, and they had close relations with the state of Israel as far as military cooperation. Their only real ally of the Armenians were the Russians and the Iranians. The Russians seem to have kind of abandoned them recently. And so this kind of left Armenia in a lurch, which is one of the reasons why they lost Nagorno-Karabakh and why their population was expelled back into, well, not the same people, but where their ancestors came from, back into the Armenian Republic. So, yeah, Armenia is geographically in a bad position. Most of what was historically Armenia is the area now in eastern Turkey, which was completely ethnically cleansed by the Armenian genocide during World War I, which means the only place that you have a concentrated Armenian population in historic Armenia was the Armenian Republic, formerly Nagorno-Karabakh, which they've lost, and then also a place called Meskhetiya Javakhetiya. So Javakhetiya, next to Armenia in Georgia, has a large Armenian population, but I don't think they'll be able to challenge Georgian rule over that in the wake of losing the much more important territory of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Why doesn't the world or the news media care about the ethnic cleansing of Armenians?
There's nobody to make them care. I mean, there is a powerful Armenian diaspora, but it's kind of limited to Los Angeles, Fresno, and a few other places, mainly in California. So they certainly don't have the type of international reach that either the Jewish pro-Israeli lobby or the Arab pro-Palestinian lobbies have internationally. And Turkey is a pretty important country as far as trade with many places. So a lot of people just don't want to, I mean, it's already a fait accompli. They don't want to upset the Turks. There's always been a long running issue of the recognition of the Armenian genocide, which kind of strange, because historically, obviously, there was a genocide, but the Turkish government, in kind of a just power flex, just denied it completely and did a lot of lobbying to prevent other governments from recognizing this historical fact.
And why would Israel have an interest in supplying Azerbaijan?
There has been, I said, the geopolitics. Turkey, for a long time, was a close friend, relative, at least much more friendly than any of the Arab states with Israel. They had full diplomatic and trade relations. Armenia, I said, their main ally is Iran, which has this militant anti-Zionist stance that is more of a moral issue for them than a geopolitical issue. So, and Azerbaijan is also the major supplier of oil to the state of Israel. So the Israelis, one of their strategies for kind of surviving the hostility of surrounding Arabs was to make friends with the non-Arabs that bordered the Arab. So that included Turkey, that included Iran while the Shah was in power, and that included Ethiopia. So the kind of these non-Arab powers in the region had historically much better relations with Israel than the Arab states did. And Azerbaijan kind of just followed the lead of Turkey in that.
Now, is there a great deal of contempt, say, among Iranians and the Turks for Arabs? Do they make invidious assertions about Arabs and camels?
Some of them do. There is an Arab minority in both countries, and they're not particularly persecuted. But you do hear, Turks and Persians tell Arab jokes. You also tell them jokes about each other. And there's also the fact that the minorities that the Turks and Iranians are most concerned about are not the Arabs. In both cases, it's really the Kurds. And the Kurds, I think, have probably the best kind of take on this kind of interethnic conflicts. And they said, Well, we don't mind so much when the Arabs oppress us because they are uncivilized and uncouth people. So what could you expect of them? And the Turks are even worse. But it's a shame that such civilized and cultured people as the Persians would oppress their Kurdish brothers.
Now, who needs each other more? Does Turkey, does NATO and America have more need for staying in Turkey's good graces, or does Turkey need to stay in NATO and America's good graces? Because Turkey does not speak like a typical member of NATO.
Yeah, so Turkey has moved more towards the Middle Eastern and Central Asian and Caucasian pivot in for the last 3 decades because of their blocked admission to the European Union. So it's obvious they're never going to become a member of the European Union. So they have expanded their relations with countries to the east and the south as kind of a way to make up for this. But the whole existence of NATO was kind of an anachronism because it was meant to oppose the Soviet Union, which hasn't existed for 30 years. Right? So the whole Soviet position in the Caucasus, right, doesn't exist. Now we have instead independent Armenia, independent Georgia, independent Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan and Armenia at war. Of course, Armenians and Turks have a long history of conflict, as do the Azeris and Armenians. So, in a sense, they've gone back to the kind of pre-Soviet configuration. The Soviets kind of froze those conflicts in the Caucasus by having total control over the region.
What do you make of Joe Biden's trip to Israel? Just absolutely unprecedented in American political times. I can't think of any other politician who would have done that except for possibly Donald Trump, and that's just because he's so unpredictable.
I don't know. My own personal feeling about all these conflicts is that the more the U.S. can be made neutral, the better for the United States. And that there isn't any side in most of these conflicts, particularly those that have an ethnic basis, that is going to be beneficial to the majority of Americans. Obviously, there's some people who make profit off of various conflicts, and there are some people that have various connections. But for the most part, the kumbaya version of history where Kurds, Arabs, Turks, Persians, and Jews are all going to hold hands and sing kumbaya is not going to happen. So there isn't ever going to be a time when all these people love each other. And there's never going to be a time when if one of them who thinks they're aggrieved, who has power, isn't going to attempt to use it in some sort of way, even if it's kind of just totally symbolic. And that's what you see again and again with various Palestinian movements, things like plane hijacking, things like the recent attack by Hamas. They make a lot of visual attention for the world, and they can sometimes kill quite a few civilians, but we're no closer really to a Palestinian state today than we were in the 1980s, and arguably we're much further away from it than we were at the beginning of the 2000s.
Now, what have you been working on as far as your academic interests over the past couple of years?
Well, I had this book published in 2022. It's Years of Great Silence. It's the history of ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, particularly during the Second World War. And I managed to get all the documents out of Moscow that I needed before Russia invaded Ukraine. So this is like one of the last books that got archival access from Moscow, written in English by a Westerner. So that's been out since March 2022. And then I have a book chapter coming in a book. It's on Germans in Kazakhstan. I believe the title is Russian Germans on Four Continents, which is about ethnic Germans from Russia in their dispersal from Europe to Asia and the various other continents, most notably North and South America.
And you look a little different. You look like a surfer. Have you taken up surfing?
No, I've taken up working as a janitor and nobody cares what I look like. So I've just been too lazy to go to the barber shop.
Now, don't you have like familial connection? Is it Azerbaijan or what are those Jan
No,
countries?
Kyrgyzstan. Yes, I have
Kyrgyzstan.
family in Kyrgyzstan.
Do you get back there much?
I haven't in a while. I was back there for a while in 2021. I was there for an extended period of time, and then I came back to the U.S. and for a brief time of 7 months was a middle school teacher, and that was absolutely horrible. There were 2 times I thought I was going to die. First time was actually on Day of the Dead, my Day of the Dead mug, which would have been very fitting.
Why did you think you were going to die?
I thought I was having a heart attack. My blood pressure shot way up.
Just from dealing with kids?
Dealing with 130 unruly, undisciplined American 12 and 13-year-olds. Yeah, it's not something I've ever been trained to do. And I was pretty glad when they asked me to resign in exchange for a generous severance package.
Wow. And what is it like working as a janitor?
It doesn't use a lot of brain power, but I mean, you just get up early in the morning. So I start 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on what day, and you just go through the routine. Although sometimes, like yesterday, I got last hour of my shift. For some reason, somebody shit all over the floor of the men's room. That wasn't very pleasant.
And do you get to have many intellectual discussions with your fellow janitors?
Not the fellow janitors, because they only have one of us working at a time. But customers, believe it or not. Okay,
so you've had some good chats with customers.
Yeah, so there's some strange people. Yeah. So every so often you'll meet some guy who's, they may be like a welder, but they'll have like all this weird esoteric knowledge of things. So like I met this guy the other day. He has like a weird esoteric knowledge of like all of the all of the communist movements in the Middle East.
Wow. Did you work as a butcher or some other job in the last couple of years?
I was a cashier, and then I moved to being a janitor.
So you weren't really a people person? Is that the reason for the move?
No, because they wouldn't give me the cashiers. They limit strictly on the hours, and so when their morning janitor retired, they offered it to me so I would stop complaining about not getting enough hours.
And are you the only white janitor?
Yes, everybody else is Hispanic.
And what's the job market right now for historians?
Very bad. It doesn't get any better. I don't know what they're looking for. The last job I applied to that I got rejected from, the head of the history department, his main area of research was Brazilian soccer. And the one before that, the woman who headed the history department, her main area of research was French hookers. So obviously, writing political history is no longer in fashion.
And what have you been asked to submit a diversity statement?
I have one. I have it on my Substack, my diversity statement. I put it up there. Let me see if I can find it.
And what was it like crafting that? Well, here, just go ahead and find it, and I'll just fill the space. So
yeah,
you can
it's basically talking about how I have experience teaching all kinds of different ethnic groups in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But it's
I mean, you've lived it, man. I mean,
right.
You've been all around.
But okay, diversity and inclusion statement. I'll put it in the chat.
That's what I'm anticipating. Perhaps I'm going to say the
too many
funniest
tabs
outcome is that
open
that's
here.
not who the moons are named after.
But that was my problem when they interviewed me for the job here for a middle school teacher, right?
Yeah.
It was all on, can you handle diversity as far as the Hispanic population? But there was nothing on, can you handle very unruly 12 and 13-year-olds who are going to be completely undisciplined?
Yeah. And how is your social media and Substack and Twitter and online presence, has that affected your ability to get a job as a historian?
I don't know. Probably, but it's hard to say whether anybody pays attention to it and whether it makes any difference at this point. I'm now in my 50s, so probably unlikely that I will get another academic job in my working years. But it comes and goes. For a long time, there was absolutely nothing for Russian and Soviet history, and then with the war in Ukraine, there was a few jobs. I think I applied to 5, but now the war is ending, so it looks like they're all going to dry up again.
Are you willing to head back overseas to teach history?
Sure, but those jobs have dried up too. I mean, before the Putin invaded Ukraine, I had a couple applications in Moscow and Tumen, but they stopped hiring Americans when the U.S. Came out in support of Kiev against Moscow.
And I mean, Norman Finkelstein didn't get tenure at the University of Chicago. I believe that Alan Dershowitz was a prime mover in trying to deny him. Daniel Dresner didn't get tenure at the University of Chicago. It's thought in large part because he was writing a blog. I believe that Eric Siegel was an assistant professor at Yale in the English department, but when he published Love Story and it became a huge popular success, that just doomed his chances of getting tenure. Can you talk about the academic attitude towards popular success and how that kind of hurts your standing as an academic, or it can?
I don't know. I really, my entire academic career was, as far as being in any institutions and being able to see directly on the inside, with outside the United States. So I did my PhD and master's in London, and then I taught in Kyrgyzstan and Ghana and Iraq. But you do seem to have in the English-speaking world these kind of pop star professors at some of the bigger universities. We already mentioned Edward Said, who probably was far too much on the popular side and far too little on the scholarly side as far as his work. But there are people, Timothy Snyder at Yale, for instance, is very well known now, mainly because of his punditry, which I don't think much of. But his book, Bloodlands, which was quite good, I thought, became very popular. His next book, Black Earth, I haven't read yet, but going from the titles after Black Earth, he doesn't seem to have done much historical scholarship as opposed to polemics.
Do you have any idea what are the odds for someone getting a PhD from, let's say, a top 50 worldwide university? What are their odds of locating a job in the first world as a history
for
academic?
History, they've been getting smaller and smaller just because. So the job that I applied to, that was the department is run by the Brazilian football expert, for a entry-level position to teach Russian, Soviet, Eurasian, and East European history. They received 110 applications.
Wow.
For one job. And I've seen where there's been more, 200 and plus. So That's very different than most of the economy. I mean, when I applied to be a janitor, there was one applicant.
So, how much do you take your job prospects into consideration before you say post on social media, if at all?
Oh, none, because
No.
it's not going to matter for my current job, and I don't think I have much of a chance of of getting an academic job, regardless of any of that. Simply the statistical odds, right? So let's say everything's even, which they're not, because I'm older, and the subject matters that I write about is not particularly in vogue, as is my methodology, and but really the areas. So like political history has not been something that's been in vogue for a long time. So, but even if it was all even, right, you still only have between 1/2 and 1% chance. That's not very good. You might as well play the lottery.
Now, you're not someone who, to the best of my knowledge, embraces what are called conspiracy theories. But on the other hand, Andy Nowicki, who you've done a lot of shows with, does embrace what are called conspiracy theories. So, what's it like doing these shows with someone who has a very different approach to the world?
I like Andy. I've met him personally.